Nargo is a mid-level demon who uses a special ability called Jit to summon up to 2 large pairs of hands. These monstrous hands, despite their appearance, are capable of performing delicate actions. This unique ability of his earned him the attention of the demon lord, Helios, leading to his appointment at a small garrison located near the base of operations of the heroes. This garrison is Shejima Cave, and Nargo is now in charge of the men there. In short, he has been appointed as the managing director of a dungeon. Since Shejima Cave is within the vicinity of the heroes, Nargo is meant to be their first opponent. Nargo thinks that it would be absolutely hilarious if he ended up defeating them first. Nargo enters Shejima, only to find it in a dilapidated state. The traps in front of the entrance no longer work, while the monsters guarding nearby have no motivation at all. Not even corporate pizza parties can save them now. In Nargo's eyes, this whole place seems more like an abandoned cave than a dungeon. Gunso, an obese slime-in-chief of the first floor, struggles to climb up the stairs. Nargo descends to the second floor, which is populated mostly by fairies and plant monsters. Oberon is nowhere to be found. While Nargo inspects the area, he runs into Ron, the person in charge of the second floor. Ron eyes him sleepily before going back to her nap, confident that he isn't the new mid-boss in charge of the dungeon. Nargo descends to the third floor, where he observes the monster in charge, Ketsu, slowly and quietly flying by. From what Nargo can see, the dungeon he's been put in charge of is doomed. He immediately calls an emergency meeting between the first 3 floor bosses he encountered, Gunso, Ron, and Ketsu. Nargo tells them how disappointed and appalled he is by the condition of the dungeon. Even children who wander inside manage to get away unscathed. However, Gunso points out that they're the first dungeon, so they're not supposed to be formidable. Ron adds that with how far they are from the Demon King's castle, they barely get any new supplies or monsters to use. Ketsu has nothing to add. She's suffering from low blood sugar. Both Gunso and Ron don't see the point in developing, as doing so would only invite attention from the heroes. Nargo tries to appeal to their sense of honor and loyalty to Garhelios, but they have no idea of who he's talking about. Ron remarks that they've never even seen his face before. They leave the meeting room, ignoring Nargo's shouts and screams. Ron says that if he wants them to follow him, he has to prove himself first. Until then, they'll do things the old-fashioned way. As soon as they are away, Gunso remarks that Nargo seems like a formidable demon, though Ron wonders why he was transferred here if he is supposedly powerful. Gunso plans to open a food stall if he loses his job at the dungeon, though Ron points out that as a poison slime, he shouldn't be handling food. Nargo is dispirited at first, but since Garhelios entrusted the dungeon to him, he'll be damned if he doesn't at least try. He summons his hands to his side, fully intending to completely overhaul and reform the entire dungeon. By the time he's done with the place, the heroes will fear the name Shejima. The next morning, Ron is shocked to see that her dreary, second-floor cave has been transformed into a beautiful, sprawling paradise. Ron angrily asks Nargo what he's done to her floor, and he replies that all he did was sprinkle some fertilizer. He points out that the state of her forest would have made her ancestors really disappointed. When she asks him how he knows about that, he replies that the fairies in the forest told him all about it. The fairies, once nodding off in the darkened corners of the forest, are now spry and full of life. They merrily dance around in the air, and Ron sees what a difference a little fertilizer can make. One of the fairies drifts down and happily tells Ron what a huge change Nargo has made in a single night. Ron changes her mind about her new boss. Though Ron admits that Nargo did a good job rehabilitating her dungeon, she hasn't truly accepted him yet. The dungeon still has a lot of work to do before it is presentable. The nearby fairies don't know why she's being so difficult, and they all say that Ron is just being shy and bashful. Nargo acknowledges that there is still much to be done, and he hands Ron some documents about how he plans to improve the dungeon's second floor. He even added some pictures so that the fairies could understand it. Though Nargo is plenty capable, he feels more comfortable leaving the rehabilitation in Ron's hands since she's far more familiar with plants than he is. He entrusts the care of the fairies to her, and he'll take care of the rest of the dungeon. Nargo returns to the first floor, where Gunso is just as furious as Ron was earlier. He demands an explanation as to why there is suddenly a huge army of slimes. Nargo introduces Gunso to his newly hired slime monster employees. Gunso protests their sudden hiring, and Nargo points out that Shejima Cave is heavily understaffed, which is directly the result of the arrogance and pride of Gunso and his predecessors. Gunso scoffs like an old man, convinced that Nargo couldn't possibly understand their situation. Nargo brings out a series of letters written by Gunso, detailing that he was thrown into this job without any training and that many of his suggestions went unnoticed by the upper brass. Gunso is also planning to retire after a year, especially after learning that his old dungeon mid-boss is leaving as well. Nargo looks Gunso in the eye and says that the continued job shortage within the dungeon is the result of Gunso's efforts. Nargo knows that many of the old guards that still work within the dungeon were raised by Gunso, and as the most senior member here, he knows just how badly the dungeon has fallen. Gunso is tired, and he wants to retire soon. The reason why he hasn't hired anyone new is so that nobody ever has to see the dungeon fall from grace even more than it already has. Nargo implores Gunso not to shy away from welcoming new blood. He's confident that the old slime still has a few more years left in him. Nargo entrusts Gunso with improving his floor while he works to improve the entire dungeon as a whole. Gunso, encouraged, agrees to try again. Nargo plans to head to the 3rd floor to see how things are going, but before that, he has some other work to attend to. The 1st floor's amenities are restored to their original glory. The trapdoor is working, the warehouse is stocked, and the toilet has indoor plumbing again. All the monsters know that this was all the work of Nargo. The various skeletons and goblins don't even know what to make of all these sudden improvements. Even Ron is encouraged to work a little harder, though she thinks that Nargo is doing more than what is expected of him. Suddenly, Ron is swept away by a crowd of monsters after they hear Nargo is going up against the 3 goblin brothers of the cafeteria. Ketsu, too sleepy and unbothered to move out of the way, is also swept away by the tsunami of monsters. Nargo enters the empty cafeteria and encounters the 3 goblin chef brothers. Identifying him as the new mid-boss, they instantly become hostile, believing that Nargo is here to make some budget cuts. They draw their cleavers, ready to chop up their new boss, but Nargo reassures him that he isn't here to destroy their cafeteria. On the contrary, he's here to eat. Nargo complains that he's been working non-stop since last night, so he really likes something to eat. The goblin chefs smirk, and they promise to return with the finest meal they have. A few minutes later, they return with their hearty specialty dish, goblin-style tripe stew. It's the stewed guts of a 6-eyed goat. The goblin's other brothers are worried that they're going too far by serving Nargo such a deplorable dish, but the eldest goblin chef insists that Nargo has to eat it. The stench of the dish alone is enough to make the eyes of the monsters water. Ron covers her nose, but Ketsu isn't so lucky. She literally passes out from the smell. Nargo looks behind him and sees how badly the dish has affected his subordinates. The goblin chef asks him if he's scared and tells him that there's no reason to eat it. There are people who have cried just trying to eat the dish. Nargo decides to try it out. Nargo takes a bite of the goblin tripe stew, chews the meat and swallows. To the goblin chef's surprise, Nargo is still alive. In fact, Nargo complains that the dish could have been better. Nargo consumes the whole dish, soup and all. Even the goblin chef is trying to tell him to stop. Nargo lowers the dish, grabs some tissue, and dabs his mouth. He then stands up and asks one of the goblin chefs to hand over his apron. He's not out of Master Chef. Nargo just wants to use it to cook a dish. He also asks them to secure some ingredients. Nargo uses his jit to assist him in the kitchen, allowing him to do the work of 5 men at the same time. While Nargo is hard at work preparing his dish, the eldest goblin chef watches him doubtfully. Not long after, Nargo completes his dish, the very same 6-eyed goat tripe stew that the goblin chef made earlier. It was made with the exact same ingredients, with the only difference being that Nargo cooked it himself. The goblin chefs slowly approach the table, and Nargo encourages him to have a taste before it gets cold. The eldest goblin chef takes a bite, unconvinced that such a pleasant-smelling dish could possibly satisfy his palate. Suddenly he keels over, causing his 2 brothers to accuse Nargo of poisoning him. However, the eldest brother tells him to stop. The dish is delicious, more delicious than words could ever describe. The stew is in a whole other class of its own. His 2 brothers take a bite for themselves, and they are sent into the same paradise of flavors. The monsters watch as the goblins gobble up the stew, and they smell the dish's scent wafting towards them. Even Ketsu returns to life and she wakes up. The eldest goblin puts down his bowl and asks Nargo if he used some sort of special ingredient, but he replies that he didn't. Every ingredient used in the dish came directly from the kitchen. Nargo didn't make the dish for him either. He calls Ketsu forward, and she sleepily steps forward. Nargo asks her to try the dish he made. Ketsu tries to turn him down since she does poorly with strong-smelling dishes, but Nargo encourages her to try. She reluctantly hovers over toward the table, and Ron doubts that Nargo could ever win Ketsu over to his side. Ketsu takes a seat with a fork hovering over the bowl. Time seems to stand still as everyone waits for her to take a bite. Ketsu carefully smells the stew, as though she were inspecting it for poison. When she takes a bite, she finds it delicious, more delicious than any Belmont blood she's ever tasted. Ketsu's voice becomes unnaturally high-pitched and peppy, which the residents of the dungeon find strange. Nargo tells them that Ketsu was suffering from chronic anemia, which was a result of her being a picky eater and not having anyone to suck blood from. The six-eyed goat stew addresses these problems all at once. Nargo planned to feed Ketsu this dish from the very beginning. Ron's opinion of Nargo really changes now. Despite being an absolute newcomer to their dysfunctional family, Nargo has managed to identify and understand all their problems. Nargo tells the three goblin brothers that confidence in themselves is a good thing, but they should never forget that they're meant to cook for others, not themselves. The eldest goblin asks Nargo if he'll teach them, and he replies that he's sure they'll make even more delicious dishes in the future. The eldest brother tells his siblings not to cry out in public, yet they do so all the same. The nearby monsters, as evil as they are, can't help but be touched by such an emotional scene. Nargo brings out his restoration plan, having finally completed laying the groundwork. The three goblin chefs approach Nargo, impressed by the six-eyed goat stew he made. They promise to figure out how to recreate it one day. They promise never to make their disgusting goblin-styled stew again, but Nargo tells them that they can just leave it on. He genuinely liked the dish. The whole room falls silent, even the chefs. That dish was supposed to be inedible. Nargo wonders if he misunderstood something somehow. A year later, Shejima Cave is a completely new place. Monsters are busily walking, flying, and crawling to and fro to make improvements to the dungeon. Nargo whizzes right past the busy work floor, trying to properly manage the massively increased workload as a result of the dungeon now being fully functional. Though he's never been busier in his entire life, Nargo finds the work fulfilling, especially now that the dungeon seems full of life. Ron visits Nargo in his office, telling him that it wouldn't kill him to compliment her every now and then. It's already been a whole year, after all. The dungeon has changed a lot since Nargo was put in charge. Nargo smiles, reminiscing about the terrible conditions that the place used to be in. He shows her a report from several years ago, revealing that the recommended level to conquer Shejima Cave back then was between 6 and 8. A few weeks ago, that assessment changed. The new recommended level is now over level 30. Ron's eyes go wide. That would mean that the hero would need to gather a mid-level party. Shejima Dungeon has truly become a formidable dungeon in its own right. Nargo smiles as he watches Ron laugh. When she asks him what he's looking at, he lowers his head. He was just wondering when the hero's party would finally come, though Ron would prefer it if they were never attacked at all. Nargo has the same opinion. It would be best if they were never attacked, though he finds it strange that the heroes haven't shown up at all in a year. He wonders if they're still holed up in the castle, and at this rate, the Demon King will inspect his dungeon first. Ron snaps her fingers, recalling that the audit was supposed to be a month ago. Nargo remembers it too, and he finds it strange. The audits are always on time. Ron remarks that the Demon Lord must have forgotten their dungeon, but Nargo holds Garhelios in high esteem. Regardless, something strange is going on. Suddenly, a fairy flies into the room, warning them that the hero's party is coming. Nargo smiles. Finally, a challenge. Their battle will be legendary. However, the fairy isn't finished with her report. The hero's party has defeated Garhelios, and now they're doing a full sweep of the country. Their next target is this dungeon, and the hero party's average level is a whopping 72. As news of Garhelios' defeat spreads throughout the dungeon, panic sets in. Some weep, some scream, while others still remain silent. Level 72 is too high of a hurdle for them to overcome. If this is truly the same hero's party that defeated Garhelios, then they stand no chance. Another fairy flies in to report that the heroes will be arriving in 30 minutes. That's too little time to make any meaningful changes to their defenses. Nargo made contingency plans in case of emergencies like this, but he never anticipated that the hero's party would attack them with such force and power. Gunso asks Nargo what kind of ridiculous situation they found themselves in. A hero with double-digit levels shouldn't be coming to their beginner dungeon. Nargo thought as much too. He concludes that the heroes must have passed by their dungeon already, but judged its threat to be minimal. Regardless of their reasons, the fact remains that the heroes plan to end their journey by conquering Shejima Cave. Gunso falls into a panic. Their slime core won't stand a chance. Nargo knows this already. Ketsu flies in, Nargo noting that her appearance and demeanor are a far cry from how she was before. He briefs her on the hopeless situation they've found themselves in. Ketsu takes a seat at the war table and suggests a surprise attack involving poison and a horde of undead, but Nargo points out that with how high-leveled the heroes are, it wouldn't be far-fetched to expect them to have resistances to all sorts of debilitating status effects. If the party happens to have a Weissman in their ranks, one large-scale magic spell is all it would take to destroy Shejima Cave completely. Hearing Nargo shoot down idea after idea for a counterattack causes the reality of their situation to really set in. Ron asks Nargo what they're supposed to do now. Nargo looks around the war room and at the faces of the comrades he's come to respect over the past year. They all look to him for an answer to this mess. Nargo taps Ron on the shoulder and names her as the new boss of Shejima Cave. They ask him if he really is just leaving everything to Ron and leaving, and he says yes. He remarks that he was never proper mid-boss material in the first place. They'd pressed him for a better explanation, but he says nothing else and leaves. Nargo stretches and wonders what he should do with his newfound spare time. Ketsu can't believe that Nargo could just get up and leave like that after everything they've been through. Opinion suddenly turns against Nargo, whom they start calling a traitor, but Ron isn't so sure that Nargo would do such a boring thing. One of the skeletons asks Ron what's on her shoulder. Ron looks down, and one of the monsters identifies it as a resonating bell. They usually come in pairs, and no matter how far you are, ringing one bell will ring the other. Adventurers use it to tell their families that they're still alive. Ron now knows that Nargo gave her the bell, but she doesn't know what for, nor do they know where the other bell is. Gunso says that it doesn't matter, but Ron is sure that the bell has some significance. Ron tries to think about why Nargo would give her the bell, and it hits her. There's only one entrance into Shejima Cave. Otherwise, there's no way to escape. Soon, the whole room realizes what Nargo is up to. Outside, Nargo seals the entrance to Shejima Cave with a powerful spell, something that would take even a demon lord a few hours to unlock. A boss standing outside their dungeon isn't unheard of after all. Nargo hopes that Ron can become a wonderful boss in his place. A loud voice asks Nargo who he is. Nargo turns around, and he proclaims himself as the ruler of Shejima Cave. Grant, a loud, obnoxious Weissman, introduces themselves as Bronze Sword, the party that defeated the Demon Lord. Deer, their fighter, threatens to bash his head in if he doesn't lower his volume. Nargo observes that the Weissman isn't very capable, but there's someone who can more than pick up the slack. The hero, Bernhardt. As Nargo observes them throwing around witty banter, he wonders if they forgot him just standing there. Grant whips out his staff, seeking to avenge their barbarian, who is currently too injured to move. He challenges Nargo to a one-on-one battle. Nargo feels intense pressure emanating from Grant. Despite his class being that of a long-range supportive spellcaster, Nargo can tell that he's actually one of their primary damage dealers. Grant praises Nargo for protecting his comrades, but he firmly believes that demons have souls that are completely incompatible with the world. He will destroy him and reduce him to atoms. Nargo confirms that Grant intends to enter the dungeon and destroy the monsters within, and he asks them once, and only once, to surrender. Grant refuses to surrender. Demons cannot be allowed to live, not on his watch. Grant starts casting a powerful magic spell, but Deer warns him that he's expending a great deal of magical energy. Grant replies that this is his way of showing his respect, by going all out from the very beginning. Grant casts Black Flare, a giant ball of dark flame large enough to blot out the sun. Nargo knows that not even Garhelios could take one of these attacks and escape unscathed. As Grant prepares to unleash his spell, his allies grin smugly. Are you sure these guys are the heroes? Nargo asks if he can say his final goodbyes, and Grant allows him to, but only for 3 seconds. Nargo remarks that he has a rather unusual way of saying his goodbyes. Nargo summons his hands above Grant's Black Flare spell, and Bernhardt warns his Weissman to withdraw his spell at once. Bernhardt was quick to warn Grant, but not quick enough. Nargo casts his signature magic, Graviton, subjecting Grant to a powerful gravitational force, enough to strain even his mighty muscles. Blood leaks out of Grant's mouth, impressed that his muscles were pushed to their limits by just one spell. However, what he didn't anticipate was his own Black Flare spell crashing on himself. In an instant, Grant is obliterated. His comrades, their mouths agape, watch as the dust settles. This is why Nargo considered himself to be a poor mid-boss. A subordinate should always be stronger than their boss. Nargo assembles his 4 hands in a row, and he asks them again if they'll surrender. The Tower of the World is a secret, high-level dungeon known only to a select few high-ranking demons, including the Demon Lord himself. Humans that find this dungeon must be at least 5'6" and level 90 to enter it. At the very top of the Tower of the World lies the Overlord, incomprehensibly more powerful than the Demon King. To reach the top, one must also overcome 8 powerful monsters known as the Floor Guardians. The first of these guardians is the level 92 hellhound named Kutsuki, popularly known as the Overlord's pet. It is said that if Katsuki ever left the tower, the world would end within a week. However, such a thing will never happen. A seal prevents them from leaving the tower of their own power, and as such, the tower is considered to be the last bastion of all demonkind. You might be wondering, why is Nargo talking about this? That's because Nargo is one of those guardians, the immortal level 99 guardian of the 64th floor. Like many of the floor bosses of the Tower of the World, Nargo grew bored waiting and lazing around. The story of how the Demon Lord scouted him as the mid-boss of Shejima Cave, however, is another story. Right now, he has other fish to fry. Deer panics as she sees Grant being killed in an instant, but Bernhardt manages to restore her composure. Bernhardt himself is quite surprised at how easily Grant was defeated, but this tells him that Nargo is not a third-rate mid-boss of some fourth-rate dungeon. He deduces that since Nargo used Graviton, a high-ranking spell, he shouldn't be able to use spells for a long time. Based on Nargo's silence, Bernhardt considers his deduction to be the truth. Bernhardt gives credit where credit is due. Even though it was a surprise attack, Nargo was still able to defeat Grant. But that's where it all ends. Magic users with no magic power are no longer a threat. Nargo asks him if he's going to come. Bernhardt's going to come alright. He tells Deer to follow his lead. They're going to go kill a demon. Deer, finding courage in Bernhardt's words, takes up her axe and follows him into battle. This proves to be a headache for Nargo. They should have surrendered when they had the chance, but now he's going to have to exert a little more effort. Deer dopes herself up with stacking body strengthening spells, which Nargo knows can allow humans to truly transcend their limits. Nargo doesn't even clearly see Deer move, and he realizes now why Garhelios was defeated. Even so, Deer is too slow for him. One of Nargo's fists sends Deer flying back where she came from, but she isn't dead, only stunned. Nargo commends her formidable defense. Bernhardt can't believe that Deer, who fought armies of demons and the 4 heavenly kings all on her own, was defeated in her specialty of close combat. Nargo jokes that she was lacking in dexterity. Bernhardt realizes now how short-sighted he was. Calling Nargo a simple mid-boss was a mistake. There's nothing mid about him at all. Bernhardt charges his sword with a holy glow, an indicator of divine power. Bernhardt thinks he has Nargo all figured out, and he deduces that he's just some lowly summoner. His comment makes him laugh. Nargo's used these hands for as long as he can remember, and he never once considered them familiars or summoned monsters. They're just a part of his body. Bernhardt aims for Nargo's main body, confident that this is his weak point. Nargo catches Bernhardt's sword mid-swing and he just stares at him. That's cold, man. Bernhardt can't believe what he's seeing. His sword won't move an inch, even though he is supposedly a hero blessed by God. He defeated the Demon Lord and brought peace to the world. He's supposed to return home and bask in the applause of the simpletons of his village. Nargo remarks that if he hadn't made the detour he did, he could have been doing just that. Nargo tells him that he had no reason to come to Shejima Cave, considering how powerful of a hero he is. Bernhardt sticks out his tongue. He doesn't need a reason to destroy the pathetic hideout of some lowly demon. Nargo's demeanor changes. As a mid-boss, he's used to being called names and taunted, but he won't stand for his subordinates being insulted. Bernhardt turns pale as he realizes that he is being overpowered, and he tries to beg for mercy. Sorry, all out of mercy. Nargo tosses Bernhardt into the sky, and he formally introduces himself as Senju Nargo, the former mid-boss of Shejima Cave. He summons his 5 hands, which simultaneously blast Bernhardt with beams of hellfire. Not even ashes remain. Despite his easy victory, Nargo envied Bernhardt. He always had comrades by his side, and his natural charisma caused people to flock to his side. Nargo, on the other hand, considers himself a loner. Even when he was a floor guardian, he did nothing but stand in the middle of an empty, desolate floor. He wonders if the others would have come to his aid had they known he was going to fight the hero's party. His thoughts wander to his subordinates, Gunso, Ketsu, and Ron. He knows that, with how he seemingly abandoned them, they will no longer come to his aid. Nargo always aspired to be a dungeon boss, and the short year he spent at Shejima Cave wasn't a bad one. He was always surrounded by his trusted subordinates. Nargo sighs. Even he was unable to change the outdated traditions that plagued dungeons. The whole point of his coming to Shejima was to raise their power to a sufficient level that they could fend off any attack from the hero's party. He considers this incident a failure on his part, and he considers himself a failure as a mid-boss. Nargo approaches the last remaining member of Bronze Sword, a hooded individual who hasn't spoken nor revealed their identity. When they refuse to reply to Nargo, he decides to fight them. Nargo fires his fists, but the individual miraculously survives. To think that someone out there could have survived his attack. binding chains suddenly shoot out from the cloaked individual's body, binding his hands and preventing them from moving. Nargo realizes that there was no person in the first place. The chains were bundled together to form a person. A voice explains that these chains were once used to bind heaven and the earth part. A knife finds its way into Nargo's back, and as he turns around, he sees a woman. Nargo feels an unbelievable amount of heat emanating from the dagger in his back. His whole body starts to burn up. For the first time in a long time, Nargo feels pain. The mysterious woman is glad that she was finally able to land a hit on him. Nargo cries out in anguish and asks her if they've ever met before, but all the woman says is that she won't upset what he's accomplished here today. Nargo realizes that Bernhardt's party didn't notice the chains because of their divinity. He berates himself for not noticing sooner. He asks how a human was able to get their hands on something as powerful as divine chains, and the woman suddenly addresses him as her senior. Nargo realizes that she's one of the floor guardians, but that only raises more questions than answers. Why is she in the hero's party, and why would she target him? Nargo finds it even more difficult to breathe. He's dying. The girl's face and body suddenly morph into someone else, and Nargo realizes who she is. Obviously, he doesn't say her name, because that's a different story for another time. She hopes to meet Nargo again in the future, in 100 years' time. This is the end of Nargo of the Thousand Hands. In Nargo's youth, his nickname was Crybaby, even though he really wasn't. Most of the bullying he suffered was perpetrated by a boy named Rigard and his friends. They often tied him up and left him to sleep in a manure-filled barn, or forced him to participate in their training sessions just so they could hit him with wooden swords. One day, they decide to up the ante by leaving Nargo in the middle of a dangerous forest. It's just a prank, bro. Nargo, tied up, is all alone within the Forbidden Forest, not too far from Gatel Village. Nargo wanders through the woods, wondering why Rigard always seems to harass him. He surmises that it must have something to do with how close he is to Tim, a red-haired girl whom he is close childhood friends with. Nargo suspects that Rigard secretly likes Tim, which is why he bullies him so much. It certainly doesn't help that Nargo's mother constantly says that he should just marry Tim when he grows up. Nargo looks around the Forbidden Forest. It is said that it is filled with many beast-type monsters, including a powerful, high-class arachnid. Nargo isn't really into spider monster girls, so he wants to go home as soon as possible. Nargo has bad taste. Nargo is a summoner, which means he can summon monsters by drawing magic circles. However, since his hands are literally tied, he can't summon anything. Even if he could, the best he could manage is a slime. A few hours pass, and Nargo's vision begins to go blurry. He hasn't eaten in a long time. He wonders where his parents are. He hears rustling coming from behind him, and a large mountain of boar rushes through the woods. It's a level 15 old boar. Nargo holds his breath, hoping that he doesn't smell like truffles. Fortunately, the old boar ignores Nargo and goes on its merry way. Nargo breathes a huge sigh of relief, but the fact remains that he's still trapped and lost within the forest. He hears Tim's voice coming through the trees, and he springs into action. He runs as fast as he can, and he ends up in a large forest clearing. Tim is on the ground, while a creature towers above her. Tim explains to the monster that she was just trying to search for her friend. The creature chirps, and Nargo knows what it is: the body of a bear and the head of an owl. He's the lord of the Forbidden Forest, Owlbear. Nargo rushes to Tim's side. Owlbear reassures them both that he won't prevent them from leaving this area, but the fact remains that they're still in his Forbidden Forest, a place where no one has come back alive. Nargo is afraid, but Tim is in danger. He takes a stand against Owlbear and boasts that he's a summoner, but Owlbear points out that Nargo's hands are a little tied down at the moment. Owlbear rewards Nargo's courage by using a wind cutter spell to free him from his binds. Unfortunately, Owlbear's aim was a little off. He cut off the bindings, yes, but he also cut off Nargo's hands. He's not alright, and he has nothing left. The sight of blood sends Nargo's mental state into a downward spiral. Owlbear laughs triumphantly. In the end, he was still curious about what kind of monster Nargo could have summoned had he let him. Nargo weakly lifts his head. He sees Tim shouting at him to keep it together, and he sees a pool of his blood on the floor. He musters every ounce of strength he has to shout the magic words, "Summon." When nothing happens, Nargo hangs his head. Of course nothing would come. It's just a puddle of blood. However, something does come. A giant hand. Owlbear is astonished. The hand breaks free from the chains binding it to the ground, and it comes under Nargo's control. He lost his hands, but he gained a new one. Owlbear realizes that Nargo isn't just some snot-nosed kid. Nargo declares that he's the Thousand Hands Nargo. He's finally remembered. Nargo still remembers the time he spent as a human during the past decade, and he also remembers the time he spent as the Thousand Hands Nargo. He was stabbed in the back by a dagger that shouldn't have been able to kill him, considering that Nargo was already level 99. Nargo concludes that he was stabbed with a dagger that forcibly induces reincarnation. Tim asks him why he's talking to himself when his hands are still missing and his stumps are still bleeding. Nargo nonchalantly looks down and remarks that he'll be dead in a few seconds if the bleeding doesn't stop. Owlbear starts laughing. He thinks Nargo's strange demeanor is a result of him going insane and that his summoning ritual was still a failure. In the end, it's just a big hand. Owlbear snorts that Nargo should give up on his moniker of Thousand Hands. He doesn't even have any hands anymore. Nargo bluntly casts heal on himself, and he gets his hands back. There are no scars or imperfections. It's as if they were never cut off. When Owlbear sees this, he becomes hysterical. Even high-class monsters aren't able to regenerate entire limbs. Nargo sneers and invites Owlbear to try and cut his arms off again just so he can grow them back. This angers Owlbear, so he fires off another wind cutter spell, only this time aimed at Tim's neck. Something deflects his spell right back, and it barely nicks Owlbear's neck. Nargo's hand repelled it using his middle finger, just because he wanted to style him a little more. Nargo finds it strange that he's protecting a little girl, but he still has memories of her. Right now, he's both the crybaby Nargo and the Thousand Hands Nargo. Nargo tells Owlbear to aim at him again, and if he doesn't, he'll aim for his neck for real next time. Owlbear starts getting nervous, and he calls out his trusted companion Old Boar. The large boar from before rushes through the woods, and Tim urges Nargo to run. Owlbear boasts that Old Boar is the strongest warrior he has at his disposal, but all Nargo sees is a thin, aging pig. Nargo is actually embarrassed for him. Furious, Owlbear orders Old Boar to trample him. With one flick of his hand, Nargo sends Old Boar flying, even though he had intended to hold back. Owlbear cries as Old Boar lands a dozen or so meters away. Owlbear demands to know who Nargo really is, and Nargo says that they should have a little honest talk. Nargo says aloud that the rating of Owlbear's dungeon is D based on how Owlbear reacted. Nargo surmises that he hasn't received his rating yet. Owlbear still isn't convinced that Nargo is who he says he is, so Nargo repeats his earlier introduction that he is the Thousand Hands Nargo, a former dungeon master. Owlbear still doesn't believe him, and it's starting to irritate me a little too. Owlbear asks him how he knows about the dungeon assessment system, and Nargo points out that Owlbear only has one subordinate to his name, Old Boar, who has to protect the vastness of the Forbidden Forest. Nargo tells him to take a good look at Old Boar. Just like the electric fan in my room that hasn't been turned off in weeks, he's tired. Owlbear defends his decision to only employ one monster, pointing out that the power level of the surrounding area is remarkably low. Nargo tries to reason with Owlbear. He points out that a few days ago, the local king eased taxes on merchants, which is meant to stimulate the local economy. A booming economy will inevitably cause a city to prosper, and when a city prospers, adventurers gather. He asks Owlbear how he plans to deal with the powered-up adventurers, and he replies that he'll try his best. Nargo doesn't want to hear his determination. He wants to hear a concrete plan. Owlbear has no such thing, and Nargo isn't the least bit surprised. Working under Owlbear must be hell. He doesn't even offer dental. Owlbear continues to defend his position, explaining that they are understaffed. He boasts that Old Boar is a hardworking individual who never complains and puts in the work. Nargo asks him why he doesn't treat such an excellent subordinate well. From what he can see, Old Boar is being overworked to the point of exhaustion. Owlbear is flustered, but he remembers that he's just talking to some human. He doesn't have to listen to him. Old Boar, who can apparently talk, asks Nargo not to be so hard on Owlbear. Old Boar doesn't mind working for Owlbear, even if his overtime is underpaid. Nargo leers at Owlbear, who explains that he just forgot to pay him overtime. He was going to do it eventually. Regardless, Old Boar has been working at the Forbidden Forest for 40 years, and he has nowhere else to go. Nargo, a former dungeon manager himself, can't overlook such talent being wasted in the middle of nowhere. He offers to use his connections to find Old Boar a more appropriate place to work, a place that actually pays overtime. Old Boar switches teams faster than Italy, and he quits working for Owlbear effective immediately. Owlbear asks Old Boar to reconsider, pointing out that Nargo's story of being a former dungeon manager is incredibly suspect. He also points out that Old Boar is, well, old and offers little value to any dungeon that will take him in. Old Boar replies that any place is better than working in this hellhole. Owlbear, realizing that he can't change Old Boar's mind, decides to just change his state of living. He's going to kill him and Nargo right now, and he won't show mercy. even to a former employee. Nargo can't summon enough hands to defend against so many wind cutters. Olbor steps forward and offers to be his shield, but Nargo tells him there's no need to, since it's also troublesome for him to file an accident report. Nargo reassures him that he has enough hands. Owlbear unleashes a torrent of razor-sharp wind blades, but all of them are stuffed by Nargo's hands. Over 40 of Owlbear's thrown spells were captured. Nargo asks Owlbear if he'd like to surrender now. When Owlbear sees Nargo's hands about to flick him in the head, he meekly surrenders. Nargo and Tim ride Olbor back to the village. Olbor, having lived in the area for 40 years, knows the woods like the back of his hoof. Olbor hopes they're comfortable on his back. He hopes that, even at his advanced age, he can at least walk normally. Nargo tells Olbor that he's too hard on himself. He isn't that old. Nargo is glad that Olbor is free from the constraints of that horrific workplace, but his thoughts wander to his old workplace at Chejma Cave, and he wonders if his subordinates are still there. He remembers the strange girl who wanted to meet him again after 100 years. While riding back, Tim tells Nargo how cool he is for somehow defeating Owlbear and convincing Olbor to ride back with them. She's especially interested in what he was talking to Owlbear about regarding managing a dungeon, and Nargo promises to tell her about it later. A few moments later, Tim sighs deeply. She feels as though Nargo is the only one growing up. It's not really her fault, considering that Nargo is drawing on his experiences as the Thousand Hands Nargo. Tim apologizes for dragging Nargo into her mess, especially since she was the one who went out to go looking for him. Nargo tells her that she has nothing to apologize for. He's glad that she found him. Tim goes red in the face, ears, and apparently even her hands. She remarks that Nargo has changed and matured. Nargo remains calm and conservative. His memories as Nargo of the Thousand Hands are slowly returning to him, and he wants to remain cautious until he fully regains them. He asks Tim not to tell the others about what she saw here today, since it would be really troublesome for him if the others found out, especially Rigard. Tim promises not to tell a soul. As they approach the outskirts of the village, Olbor tells them to get down. He smells people and fire. Some people have come to pick them up. What he says is true. In the distance, Tim can make out the flickering lights of people from the village. Olbor leaves for now, as it would be hard to explain why he is accompanying them. Nargo and Tim emerge from the forbidden forest, and their respective parents rush over to get them. Nargo's mother embraces him, but this is a sensation that Nargo of the Thousand Hands isn't used to. Not long after, however, his mother scolds him for leaving in the middle of the night to play. However, his parents are saying a different story. Even though Rigard was the one who tied him up and left him in the forest, Rigard made himself out to be the hero of this incident. The whole village is in distress, and they're angry at Nargo for making them go through all this trouble. Nargo and Tim look at each other as they realize what Rigard has done. Even now, Rigard is spreading lies amongst the village by claiming that Nargo went of his own accord into the Forbidden Forest, and that he took Tim with him. This was Rigard's plan all along. The whole village becomes irritable, and they pin the blame on Nargo. Tim tries to stand up for him, but her father tells her to pipe down, believing that she is being manipulated somehow by Nargo. Nargo's parents encourage him to just fess up and apologize to everyone. Nargo hates Rigard for doing this to him, but he has to admit that he's a damn good manipulator. Tim apologizes to Nargo, and she blames herself for how things turned out this way. Nargo is fully prepared to just bow his head and get this over with, but he won't forget what Rigard did to him. Nargo walks toward the villagers and prepares to say his apology, but when he notices one of their torches go out, he shouts for everyone to lower their heads. Wait, that isn't what Rigard wanted to hear. Suddenly, everyone's torches go out, and it becomes pitch black. Something catches Tim's eye, something big. Over the treetops stands a massive dragon-like creature. It's a monster attracted to light, with jaws big enough to swallow children whole. What is it with isekai villagers and building villages next to murder forests?